So I'm excited to welcome Heather Holm to our webinar screen. She's been here for many of our webinar series, last time talking about her new book on wasps. So Heather is a biologist and author, a really wonderful educator who teaches about pollinators, native plants, all kinds of insects. And I asked her if she's very active on iNaturalist. She actually has, I was looking the other day, 918 species that she's observed and posted on her iNaturalist account. And you can follow her on iNaturalist to see the kinds of observations she's making. She's put a total of over 3,100 observations, individual photographs on iNaturalist. And she also plays a really key role as someone who has an expertise in insects and can help to identify other people's observations. So with iNaturalist, you don't need to know what you're observing. You just post that image and experts like Heather and others help to identify that observation for you. So she's got over 20,000 observations that she has helped to identify for other folks. And really without those talented identifiers, we wouldn't have the power of iNaturalist. It really is so key having those experts out there who are spending time helping others to learn. So Heather's going to talk about insect photography and then how we can use iNaturalist to observe and document wild bees. And just when I pulled up her the species that she's observed, you can see here they're from the most common to the least. So she has those 917 species. If you scroll through, you'll see all of her observations, but where she is in Minneapolis in the Twin Cities, very lucky to have a nice population of the rusty patch bumblebee. So you can see that her number one observation with 68 different images or observations up there is the rusty patch bumblebee. Her number two is my personal favorite, the inequalis, Coletes inequalis, the unequal cellophane bee, one of our great solitary bees. So Heather, welcome. I'm going to attempt to stop sharing now, although I've lost my share button. I don't know, Marcia, if you can turn me off. Okay, there's stop share. So Heather, hopefully you have the ability now to share.
Thanks, Denise.
And welcome, Heather. Really excited to have you here.
Great to be here. And this is, of course, a brand new presentation, as Denise said. I put together for this webinar series, not something I talk about, teaching people how to use an online platform. So hopefully you'll bear with me. I'm actually going to do this presentation sort of in the reverse order that Denise described. So I'll be starting with talking about what is iNaturalist, how to use it, just go through some basics of different devices that you can use to put your photos on iNaturalist, why I think it's an amazing platform and what you may or may not get from using the platform. And I'm going to highlight, of course, some bee-specific projects that you all may be interested in. I saw many people tuning in from the West, so I'm not going to be highlighting Western projects, but I'll talk about how to search for those and find them on the iNaturalist platform so that you can join those and help contribute your bee sightings to those specific projects. And then I'll sort of end with some pollinator photography tips. So photography is a long-time hobby of mine, so I really enjoy getting outside with the different cameras and looking for and documenting bees. So I'll give you some tips and tools on how to maybe get some better images, what to keep in mind, how not to scare bees away while you're approaching them on flowers and so on. So with that, I'll get started. Many of these slides in my presentation are direct screenshots from my iNaturalist account or iNaturalist website. And the reason I got involved with iNaturalist because our University of Minnesota had a bee atlas project that they started on iNaturalist. And prior to that, I wasn't aware of iNaturalist, but as soon as I found out about it, it really was a nice fit for a lot of what I do. I spend a lot of time taking photographs to help illustrate the books that I write. and just to have this wonderful community of people contributing to science. And so it's really basic principle. Anyone can take a photo or a sound recording of a living organism, upload that to iNaturalist, and then, as Denise mentioned, there's a number of many people on iNaturalist and many experts, and with a community looking at your observation. Hopefully they can help you narrow it down and to either genus or even species level in some cases. So I think of this as sort of the solution to the nature deficit disorder, or kids are spending too much time on screens. So this is a way that we can engage with people that may not know a lot about nature, and they can use an electronic device, get outside, learn about nature. And the really fun thing is, after you upload a photo, you eventually will get that observation narrowed down, and then you can learn more about what it is you've documented. So I'm always brainstorming on ways that iNaturalist can be used in communities, whether it's encouraging residents in a city to document what they see in the park that they walk in every day. And it's a way for people to passively learn about nature and obviously start to appreciate it. I'm not going to get into all of the things that you can do on iNaturalist, having an iNaturalist account, but these are some of the things that I will mention. That besides creating an account, contributing observations, you can also have different lists. You can follow people. You can, as Denise said, if you're an expert in a certain subject matter, you can help with identifications. You can create projects, which I'll talk about quite a bit during this presentation. And if you are maybe working at a nature center or have a geographic specific site, you can also use iNaturalist for a short-term BioBlitz platform. So getting people to document all biodiversity they find at a particular site, and then uploading that to that particular BioBlitz project. So just to get through some basics of how to use iNaturalist, it can be used on any devices, whether it's a cell phone, a desktop computer, an iPad, and so on. Many people use the cell phone version. I don't use it as much myself because I have, generally I'm taking a lot of my bee photos with an SLR. So I'll come home and download those on my desktop and then crop them and sort them and then upload them to iNaturalist. But there's a really quick and easy way to contribute to iNaturalist through the cell phone app. And after clicking on it, you can select the Observe button, which will give you a number of options. So if you're right out in the field looking at something really interesting, you can select your cell phone camera and take a picture in real time, and then upload it and enter the information along with where you are and so on. What I generally do with my cell phone is I will select the photo library and then sort through to find the image that I want to upload. And the really important thing and the nice thing about iNaturalist is it has a really amazing computer algorithm that will sort of help you narrow down, sometimes, not all the time, what you are observing. So it's really important that if your cell phone location is turned off, that the first thing you do if you're uploading an observation is to enter the location, because then iNaturalist can narrow down some suggestions for you. And once you select the photo, enter the location, and you let iNaturalist provide you with some suggestions, it'll sort through a number. This is an example where they just gave me one suggestion for this observation, longhorn bees at the tribe level. And so if you're a beginner, and I'll talk about this as well, it's better to keep your personal suggestions when you're uploading different observations to anything above genus level. Don't select a species level if you're uncertain if that's what it is. So this is a nice observation or fit. The algorithm is suggesting that this bee belongs to the longhorn bee tribe. And So again, weighing options. So if you're completely unsure, I always think it's best to push it up even to family, subfamily, or tribe level. And the reason is in order for an observation to become research grade, having multiple experts weigh in that this is at species level. If you are suggesting something at species level and you really have no idea, it takes more experts to weigh in to undo a wrong identification. So if you keep it up a little bit higher on the taxonomic level, then you're helping to get your experts getting it to the right place. And if maybe you don't see any suggestions in the iNaturalist list that they've provided you, then maybe just boost it right up to the order Hymenoptera. So pushing up even higher. Or now that you look at that photo and you think, well, maybe that isn't a bee, maybe it's a bee mimic. So you could push it up even higher in that situation and put it in the class Insecta. If you have some certainty, like this example here, where it's a type of longhorn bee, then selecting the tribe is a great way to go. And if you're an expert, then of course, and you know that this particular species can be identified to species level by a photo. And it's important to keep in mind of the thousands of bees that we have in North America, there really aren't that many that you can identify to species level by a photo. So make sure you know for certain that that's what it is and don't guess. So this is the desktop view of iNaturalist. Similar to other social media platforms, you get notifications. So if you've uploaded some various observations, when you check back on the desktop version, you can click on those notifications and find out whether any experts have weighed in on what you've submitted. Similarly, if you click on the Your Content tab, that will give you a rundown of the recent observations, or the most recent ways that people have weighed in to identify your observations. So that sunflower burrowing mining bee, or resin bee rather, I took a couple of days ago, and I got that notification that Rusty Bee has confirmed that it's the sunflower burrowing resin bee. So if you, on your desktop version, and this is what I use most frequently because I download my photographs from my large camera, have them sorted on my computer, and then I select certain ones. You select the upload button, and then you actually have more. I find this easier, particularly for adding additional information, to use the desktop version versus the cell phone version. So you're selecting your files from your computer. And here's an example. It's the exact same photo, but iNaturalist has given me a number of suggestions. And you can see that many of them are species level. So again, if you are uncertain and you're not a bee expert, I encourage you not to select a species level suggestion. Just boost it up to genus or tribe so that it can get properly sorted into research grade if possible. And so I selected species level for this particular observation, and then I will wait for other experts to weigh in on whether or not it is in fact a dark vein longhorn bee. All right, so here's another example of observation. This is a new queen, a Gyn common eastern bumblebee that I took later in the summer, end of July. And bumblebees are some of the types of native bees that we have that are larger. And if you get a clear shot, you should, many of them can be identified to species. So if many people are comfortable with doing that, particularly if you have a really good bumblebee guide for your state or area that you live in. So here's an example of it switches to research grade when two people weigh in and agree upon a species level ID. And with iNaturalist, any research grade observations get transferred to GBIF, and that through that platform is how scientists can use these observations. The other thing to keep in mind when you're using the desktop version, but also the cell phone version, is there's a number of additional options called annotations. And so you can select whether or not the bee or organism that you photographed is alive or dead. For example, I took a picture of a dead cicada last week, so I annotated that to be a dead organism. Evidence of presence gives you a number of options, whether it's an organism. Scat is one of the options. A track, so maybe somebody has taken a picture of footprints in the snow, and that's the observation, so that's the evidence of presence. Life stage, so for in the case of bees, if it's not a larva or an egg, you can easily select adult, and then if you are good at determining gender of bees, then you can select their gender as well. And this is where iNaturalist gets fun, because there's a number of probably many projects that I'm also unaware of that I would encourage you to put into the chat box if Denise is okay with that. Anything that I don't mention that you regularly use that it's bee related that others may be interested in. So I took this observation in Minnesota where I live. Many of the projects that you see listed below are collection projects, so they automatically get added to those projects. So I didn't have to manually click in the add to project field to add them. But we also have, iNaturalist has several types of projects. Besides collection projects, they also have traditional projects, and those need to be manually added. So that second Biodiversity of Minnesota project, the one above it is a collection project, so this observation immediately gets added to that, but I have to manually add it to that other Biodiversity of Minnesota project. And because this particular bumblebee that I photographed was a new queen, I also decided to add it to a project called Queen Quest, and it's also a traditional project, so I need to type that into that add to project field, manually add it. And before it gets submitted to that project, I have to enter additional information. So in this particular project, they had what is the queen behavior observed, and foraging is what I entered. And then in addition, what plant species was the bee visiting. So I have to fill out those two additional annotations and then click add, and then it gets added to that Queen Quest project. So the benefit of collection projects is the user on iNaturalist doesn't have to do anything. If it meets the parameters, it gets put into that project, but you can see the utility of encouraging people to use the traditional projects and manually add some additional information, and how that would be very valuable to certain researchers. So I'm just going to go through some of the featured projects and the annual backyard bumblebee count, and you can see it's ongoing right now. And this is a traditional project, so you would have to join the project and then add your bumblebee observations. They tend to create a project yearly for each backyard bumblebee count. So you'll find past years if you search on bees in the projects area. So make sure you're selecting the one that is the current year project. And then we have this amazing group of iNaturalist community members that have created state-specific native bee projects. So this is a shout out to Laura Zuro in Florida. She started this Florida native bees collection project. So it's automatically collecting all of the observations of native bees taken in Florida. And it's a really fun way, if you have a state-specific project, to learn about what people are most frequently observing or photographing, how many different species the project is collecting, and so on. And I'll talk a little bit more about exploring some of the project details. Similarly, pretty much many of our states and some of the provinces in Canada have specific projects. So this is a Minnesota native bee project that I established. And so once you set up a project, if it's a collection project and you set the parameters, it really doesn't require a lot of curation because these observations are added, and it's really up to the individual identifications of each of the bees that are collected in that project get sorted over time. So that curation sort of happens in a different way, but it's a really fun way to see how many species can be identified through observation by photography versus traditional sampling methods. Here's a Illinois native bee project, similar. I'm going to brag, we have 160 species in Minnesota. Illinois, you've got some catching up to do. So if you live in Illinois, start adding your bee observations to the Illinois native bee project. Similarly, Vermont has one called the Vermont Wild Bee Survey, and so on. So, and because Denise is hosting from Ohio, there's an Ohio Bee Atlas project in addition to this Ohio Bumblebee project. And so these are collection projects. Your bumblebee observations are automatically added. So with the traditional projects, it's just a little bit more work of remembering the projects you have joined and whether or not that project or your observation would fit into that project. Here's an example of a project I set up, the native bees of Eastern North America. So when I set this collection project up, obviously I had to establish the geographic range being just Eastern North America. And secondly, of course, because it's a native bee project, I had to exclude any non-native taxa from the project requirements. So though if someone took a picture of a European honeybee, for example, it would not be added to this, automatically added to this native bees of Eastern North America project. And this is the fun way that anybody, whether you have an iNaturalist account or are just curious about exploring results, you can log on to iNaturalist, click on the Explore button, and you can search on projects. You can search on a specific species, whether it's a bee or another organism. Within the project platform, you can look at, explore the results by viewing what people are seeing. So I clicked on the view all, and you can see here the top 10 bees that people are photographing and observing in Eastern North America. And one thing to point out, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, the pros and cons of using iNaturalist versus traditional sampling, many of the bees in this top 10 list are very large bees, bumblebees, large carpenter bees. So bees that, you know, for the general public are really easy to spot and then maybe get inspired to photograph. What is happening with a lot of these collection projects, if you explore the data further, is that many of the really tiny small bees that perhaps the general public would not even know to look for or see, and let alone get a good photograph of. So these collection projects, citizen science-based projects, tend to be biased toward larger size bees. So that Sam Droege posted not too long ago, early July, and I emailed Denise about this, what great timing, and he talked about, he wrote a short article on the value and limitations of iNaturalist. And so these next couple of slides, I've just sort of paraphrased what many of the bee researchers and avid users of iNaturalist weighed in on. And Sam will, of course, will be presenting in this series as well about traditional sampling methods. So what iNaturalist can't replicate or replace traditional sampling methods. So whether that's with bull traps, netting, and of course, lethal collection of bees to get species level ID. And the benefit of traditional sampling, of course, is you can detect and collect the really, really tiny bee species such as Lasioglossum, that the general public photographing would largely miss. And of course, this is the best standardized scientific approach, but it is a lethal method, which can turn off some citizen scientists who don't want to necessarily kill bees. Sam also identified that he compared some of those state collection projects with state bee lists from traditional sampling methods. And traditional sampling methods are still having 3 to 4 times more bee species than what is showing up on iNaturalist. So this is the limitation of doing bee photography, is we're never going to be able to, unless our photography skills improve or different ways to identify, we won't be able to collect all the bee species. And this, of course, is the best scientific method, unbiased estimate of true abundance. Now, iNaturalist still has a number of very good benefits. And so, of course, it's not going to give us an accurate portrait of abundance. There, as I mentioned earlier, will be bias towards the larger bees that are easier to see, easier to photograph for that matter. I still have challenging days trying to photograph those really tiny bees. And one of the limitations, of course, if we don't have experts weighing in on all of these observations being added to iNaturalist, then those observations are not getting sorted. So they're sitting out there, possibly be identified incorrectly. But this is where iNaturalist is quite interesting and fun for the general public, is it provides this platform and access to look at and explore data, to see what other people are photographing on a state level or a city level. It's really easy just to explore, enter a specific place, geographic region, a specific species, and it pulls up maps, and you can better understand what if you're looking for maybe a particular type of bee in the area that you live that only nests in sand. So you could pull up that species name and the geographic area that you live in, and then you can see where other photographers may be finding that species. And I do that from time to time. And then what's really interesting about iNaturalist, it is sort of at the granular level, has really enhanced what traditional research has documented for ranges of bees. So again, those larger bees such as bumblebees, really fine scale distribution mapping is occurring. I can say pretty much every year I'm photographing not necessarily bees, but other insects that have never been seen before or documented in the state that I live. So I'm regularly contributing to the known expansion or known range of a certain species. So that's kind of the fun thing. There's always something to contribute to science every day that I walk out my front door. And as I mentioned, with some of those traditional projects, the really nice utility of iNaturalist is we can add additional information or annotations to some of these bee observations, for example, the plants that they visit. All right, I want to just mention a couple of bee behavior projects that I thought some of you tuning in might find interesting. This is a traditional project, so you have to manually add your observation. And this one's called Bees Concentrating Nectar. So that small Lasioglossum there on the project image, she's got a large glob of nectar that she's concentrating to evaporate some of the moisture. So this is a behavior that some researchers are trying to better understand which particular bee species may be concentrating nectar. There's a project called Nesting Bees. So if you find a nesting population, you can manually add your bee photographs to the nesting bees. And I sort of looked at what some of the recent observations for the nesting bee project, and many of them bumblebees. And given that I spend a lot of time, and I know many researchers do as well, looking for bumblebee nests, and they're notoriously hard to find. And so this could be a nice project to visit and explore where people are finding nests. So just happen to have the 4 that I have featured here are all different bumblebee species. What's really kind of fun if you want to dig down into the specifics of a project. So we're still in the nesting bee project, and you can search within the project. So I searched on brown-belted bumblebee, and it pulled up the 15 observations. I'm showing 7 here of where people have documented brown bumblebees nesting. So it gets to me that I think this is really interesting, because some bumblebee species may be more prone to nesting above ground in tree cavities. The bumblebee nests that I frequently find where I live are 2-spotted bumblebee nests, and they tend to be at ground level or sometimes in or under wood. So you can explore within a project like this at the species level and maybe get some ideas about where specific species may nest. If only we had some rusty patch bumblebee nesting observation, that would be fantastic. There's also a mating bees project. This is a traditional project. So if you take a picture of bees mating, whether it's on flowers or on the ground, you can add it to the mating bees project. Bee behavior projects get even more fun. So this is the Sleepy Bee Slumber Party project, largely documenting probably the longhorn bees and bees that like the males that like to aggregate on flower heads or on foliage for the night. And this is kind of a fun way to think about how could I utilize a project to collect information. This is called the Megachile Bee Leaf Cut Project. So the observations are of the plants that people are uploading. And here I'll jump to the next slide. So here's just a snapshot of 8 observations that were contributed to the Megachile Bee Leaf Cut Project. So people see the leaf cuts on particular plants, and they're uploading that observation as the plant green ash or showy tick trefoil, and it gets added to the project so that the people who created the project can start to understand what plants are used by the leafcutter bees. And then some of the ways that I like to use iNaturalist are site-specific projects. This is a corner lot restoration in my neighborhood where we converted a heavily degraded, full of invasive species lot to a full-scale restoration. So I'm using this project. I only have 2 people contributing, me and my husband right now, but I'm still encouraging neighbors to also photograph and contribute to this project. But for me, it's a way to track diversity over time. As the restoration changes, it may become more diverse or less diverse with the plant species. So it's a fun way to see how we can restore land and attract different species. And I have found many, many different insect species that have never been seen in Minnesota in this half-acre corner lot. Similarly, the wonderful utility of documenting plant pollinator mutualisms. I started this project several years ago. It used to be called Flower Visiting Wasps of North America, and I recently partnered with some British researchers, and we've expanded the project to be worldwide, but to better understand what are the flower preferences of many of these flower visiting wasps. All right, we'll get into some pollinator photography tips. And one of the big things, especially if you are an identifier on iNaturalist, you can make the lives of identifiers much easier simply by cropping the image. And this is just a cell phone image I took a couple of days ago. And you can crop right on a cell phone photo program just by clicking on edit and then cropping the cropping symbol. So this really just makes it easier visually if you're looking through an observation and there are multiple photos of the particular bee. you don't have to zoom in on them to see the detail. So cropping is really useful. And the other thing, of course, to keep in mind is capturing multiple views. So a side profile, a top view are two examples here. But one thing not to do is don't upload 6 images that are relatively the same. So 6 slightly different side profile images is not helpful. And iNaturalist is really, you think about what sort of computer systems and backup that they need to host all of these observations. So you want to be efficient with the photos that you upload, so you're not inundating their system. And then if you're into bees, or you may want to pick up a bee guide, if you really want to drill down to the genus level or sometimes the species level for a particular bee, you want to start to learn some of the characteristics. So for example, the genus Andrena, which are medium-sized bees that are commonly active in the spring. They have facial depressions or fovea. And so it would be important in that situation to try and get an image of the face to show the fovea. And that's would immediately help someone identifying slotted into genus level. Similarly, the age-old question whether it's small sweat bee Lasioglossum or sweat bee in the genus Halictus, getting a very good image of the abdominal hair bands could help somebody narrow that down to genus. And then what about the really confusing metallic green sweat bees? What do you photograph to help narrow down any of these to genus? Some things to keep in mind would be eye shape. So trying to get a nice clear shot of the front of the face or the side of the face can be helpful. Similarly, the color of the tegula. So if you can get a top view image of Oggochloropsis showing that green kidney-shaped tegula, then that's really easy for someone identifying to get that slotted into the right genus really quickly. All right, and so just some camera-related tips, and I know many of you are probably avid photographers, and the challenge of providing photography tips is we're all using different cameras and different techniques. So I thought I'd start with cell phones. I don't generally take a lot of cell phone still images. I use my cell phone for capturing short video clips. I really like the slow motion video feature on my cell phone. I can capture sometimes grooming behaviors in slow motion or foraging behaviors. I captured the rusty patch bumblebee piercing holes in wild bergamot flower corollas in slow motion to better understand how the workers chew that flower corolla. So think about ways that you can use your camera besides still images. But what I'm showing here on this slide is just general things to keep in mind. Because I don't use my cell phone a lot for still photography, I often forget where the camera is located. And most cell phones, it's located in the upper corner. So keep that in mind. I sometimes have the camera upside down and the camera's off to the left or right when I don't have it directly over the subject matter. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is the plane of the camera, whether you're shooting with an SLR or a cell phone, you want to have that plane at the same plane as the subject matter. I've got a grasshopper here because I didn't have a nice little bee icon with a side view, but that example on the left is going to give you the top of the grasshopper will be in focus because with macro photography, you have a very narrow depth of field. As soon as you have that angled example on the right, then the middle of that grasshopper would be in focus, but the head and the end of the abdomen would be out of focus. So the more you can get that camera angle correct, whether it's a side profile or top view, is really helpful for focus. The other thing, sometimes it's just impossible to have that plane parallel with the camera. So this is a picture I took of a leafcutter cuckoo bee in the genus Coelioxys, and this bee was grasping onto a grass blade, which was just a couple of inches off the ground. And there was just no way other than me lying on the ground trying to get a perfect side profile so that whole side of the bee was in focus. One general rule of thumb for all wildlife photography is if you can't get that camera angle plane just right, the important thing to do is to get the eye in focus. For some reason, humans really don't like looking at an image when an animal or an insect eye is out of focus. So in this particular case, that's what I did for this cuckoo bee. And so how do we not scare off our subject matter? I have many photos when I come home and download them from going out and shooting bees that look like the one on the right here, that black and gold bumblebee is completely out of focus because I scared her off as I approached the flower. So it really is a different mindset of figuring out how to position yourself and move fluidly and slowly. Picture yourself a train on the tracks. So you want to move at a very slow pace and smoothly move forward toward the bee. Any jerky, sudden movements will often scare off flower visiting insects, and particularly in early spring, queen bumblebees are really finicky and do not like any kind of jerky movements, so they can be a lot more difficult to photograph. So sometimes, and probably like many of you tuning in, you get really excited because you see an insect that you've never seen before, and you immediately just forget about all these principles about moving smoothly and carefully and want to rush up to that insect to get a picture. And I've tried to override that idea frequently. And what I do is stay where I am, try and just get a maybe not so great photo, but what I call a voucher photo. So at least I can say to my friends, yeah, I actually did see this insect. This is a cuckoo wasp that I saw this summer. So that photo one is me, I cropped it, but just trying to get an image of the insect and then watching its behavior, determining whether I'm going to scare it off if I move closer or not. And then just having a lot of patience to stand in one place. Sometimes with a cuckoo bee or a cuckoo wasp, they tend to stick around if they have found a nest, so they will return. So if you just stand quietly, you can often get the photo that you were hoping to get, being a little bit closer to the subject. And then the other way, if you don't know how to move fluidly or you're constantly scaring off the bees, is to just plant yourself in front of a patch of flowering plants that seem to have a lot of visitation, and stand motionless and let the bees come to you. And so the more sort of bee observation that you do, you will start to see genus level behaviors. The example I have on this slide is Melissoides, a longhorn bee, and they pretty much only visit composite flowers, so you won't find them perhaps on a wild bergamot if there's black-eyed Susans right next to it. And the females tend to be really fast, but what they do is they often circle around a plant such as a coneflower or black-eyed Susan, collecting the pollen. So if you know to anticipate that movement, stand in one place, get ready to focus as she circles around, then you can get the photo that you were hoping to get. The other thing to keep in mind is sometimes pollinator photography is the complete opposite of other nature photography. I tend to go out on bright, sunny days. I like full sun. I get better depth of field. If you're using a point and shoot, so something other than a cell phone, of course, put your camera on the macro setting. One thing people aren't aware of, and even with, before I got a macro flash system for my SLR, I would use the in-camera flash all the time, so the pop-up flash. So the more light that you can get on the subject matter, the bee, whatever, is going to help you get better depth of field and reveal some of those critical details for the folks that are trying to identify the the observation. And also just changing your position. Some people just stand at their height level. Don't forget to crouch down to get that nice side profile of a bee visiting a flower. Sometimes I like to shoot upward, so I have a nice blue sky in the background rather than a dark, shady area behind the flowering plants. And don't expect to get good results on really windy days. So I'm constantly looking at my cell phone weather and trying to figure out when there will be a sunny day with not too much wind. But for those days that I'm out and it's really windy, I tend to look for things to photograph closer to the ground. So for example, bee nests, or perhaps cuckoo bees that are hovering around bee nests tend to hang out closer to the ground. And finally, iNaturalist is a wonderful community. I haven't touched on all the ways that you can interact with other users, but it is this wonderful platform that people are really connecting with each other as well as nature. I encourage you, even if you're still on the fence about joining iNaturalist, you can explore the data and projects that I mentioned, even if you aren't a member. If you are a member, the fun sort of community interaction, like other social media platforms, is you can leave comments on people's observations or questions. You can message other people. You can actually follow other bee photographers. So then iNaturalist sends you an email with updates of what the people you're following and what they have been observing. And the platform works well when there are also experts on doing identifications. So if you have some expertise, I encourage you to consider carving out some of your personal time to help others with identifications. We have certain bee experts such as John Asher who are doing tens of thousands of identifications, but the platform only works when we have more and more people with expertise weighing in and doing more than just contributing observations. So with that, thanks so much for tuning in. I hope I gave you a brief overview of what iNaturalist is, some photography tips. I welcome talking about camera and gear, but as I said, I know everybody has a different setup, but if you want to email me offline to ask more camera related questions, I'd be happy to answer those. And this picture is one of my favorites that I took, and that's an example of crouching low and shooting upward toward that beautiful blue sky background to capture that metallic green sweat bee. So with that, thanks so much. I'll push it back to either Denise or Marcia, and hopefully I can answer some questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Heather. Wonderful as always. And your photography is just amazing. I love to creep on you and see all the things that you're seeing out in the field. There are quite a few questions, and folks, I'm sorry that we won't be able to get through all the questions, but I've tried to kind of group them. And Heather, it's totally up to you. There are a number of questions about Seek, and I don't know if you are prepared to talk a little bit about Seek and how it can be used, but there were a few questions about Seek versus iNaturalist, and maybe you can help people just know basically what that is.
Yeah, Seek is another, I actually don't use Seek, so I'm not the right person to tell you what it is, but I believe it uses a similar sort of identification algorithm. The people that I know that use Seek frequently use it for plant identification. So I'm afraid I don't have a robust answer to that question, not knowing how to use Seek, but it's probably a way similar to Picture This, that you can get some immediate sort of narrowing down of what you may be observing.
Okay, great. And
I'll let someone comment to correct me.
Yeah, and there were some good questions and insight in the Q&A, and I know some folks online use Seek, and so feel free to put some comments into the chat. Just very basically, Seek is an app, it's a free app, and it's like an offshoot of iNaturalist. It's a way that you can quickly have something identified in the field, so you don't have to actually take the observation and upload it. But you can use your phone with Seek to take a picture of a bee or of a plant, and there'll be an an AI an identification there for you, and then you can follow up and post that to iNaturalist. So, and I know some folks are really using Seek a lot. I'm like you, Heather. I haven't used it that much, and I don't know all the ins and outs of it. But a nice free place to start if you don't want to do something like Picture This or another app that you have to purchase. There were a couple questions about how often should you upload an observation. So for example, I see lots of bombus impatiens kind of every day in my garden. Is it worth it to take multiple observations of the same bee on different days, of the same species, that kind of thing?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And as Denise showed you, I know Bombus impatiens is a stable and perhaps increasing bumblebee species. So I don't photograph it as much as Rusty Patch. So there is that, bias even with my own photography. What I would suggest is, participating in the backyard bumblebee count. And then that would be during the session. I think it's a couple of weeks. That would be the time frame that you would maybe daily photograph all the species that you find while you're out. But in general, that's a personal preference. As you saw with some of the projects that I highlighted, or almost all of the bee projects, I think Bombus impatiens is the most observed bumblebee, just because it's common and big and so on, the other things that I mentioned. So.
Mm-hmm. David wonders how researchers are using the data generated by iNaturalist, and you mentioned GBIF. Maybe you could just expand a little bit on that and how this all feeds into a bigger system.
Yeah, so the main feed I think that is of interest to researchers is GBIF. Again, it's pushing up the research grade observations from iNaturalist, and that's where it's important that there's constant curation of the different organisms and genera to make sure the data that does get used by researchers is sound. And I don't know, I'd love to tell you a specific example of how a particular researcher is using it. Maybe Denise, but I think it's still fairly new. But my understanding is it's more about understanding range and rather than abundance or the things that iNaturalist can't capture.
And so I think from a bumblebee perspective, that because I was always confused, should I be sending people to Bumblebee Watch or to iNaturalist to observe bumblebees? And Jamie Strange, who many of you met earlier in the series, who's the world-renowned bumblebee researcher and the chair of the Department of Entomology at OSU, said, both of those systems feed the data into GBIF. So we have, as researchers, we have access to those observations, whichever platform you use. So it's not like there's a competition that, you shouldn't use iNaturalist because of Bumblebee Watch or vice versa. So those, those big brains have access to that data that we're feeding into the system. Heather, there are a couple questions about tribes and what a tribe is, or how you can find out that, or you mentioned also like how you bump up an observation if you're not sure of the species. So maybe you can talk about that a little.
Yeah, when iNaturalist gives you that list of suggestions, on the right side of a particular suggestion, you can click on View, and that will open up that particular species or genus in a separate window. And from there, you can navigate further up the taxonomic chain to better understand where this fits, in an order or so on. So that's, sometimes I will do that. The suggestion, none of the suggestions are good suggestions. So I'll click on View and sort of pull back and look at family level characteristics, and if I don't feel comfortable, then I even will push it up higher and stick it into order. Sometimes those really strange wasps can throw you for a loop. So I will throw them back up to Hymenoptera sometimes. So that's a really quick way, and that's part of the time that I encourage people using iNaturalist take, is to do that exploration, to try and make sure that you're just not clicking on the first suggestion that they give you. Do some exploration and find out if it truly is a good fit, that what they're suggesting.
How about videos on iNaturalist? As far as I know, you can't upload videos. Do you know any?
I've seen a few, but I don't know. That was earlier on, so I'm not sure. I'd have to look that up, whether or not they are accepting videos. I think because of the size of the file, they were discouraging that. They do allow sound recordings, as I mentioned, but those tend to be smaller files than a video file. Mm-hmm. So that's handy for birds and so on. Yeah.
Okay. There was a question Laura asked about, should location coordinates be obscured for rare species?
Sometimes, Laura, they automatically are obscured, but that is, you can also manually obscure them. If I believe all federally endangered species, the coordinates are sort of, for example, if I take a picture of a rusty patch bumblebee, it pushes the observation several miles away from where I actually took it. So I would just find out whether state level versus federally listed species are obscured, but you can manually click that. One example is my herpetology friends tell me that people use iNaturalist to find turtles and frogs that they want to sell for the commercial trade. So you can, in that situation, you can click on obscure coordinates so that, it's not being used for illegal means.
Michelle asks if there is a lot of work in hosting a new collection project beyond the initial establishment.
Actually, there is not. The collection project just sort of works on its own, and you don't have to do a lot. It's nice to have multiple people as administrators, but there really isn't a lot of administrative work. The more work really entails the curation at genus or species level. So, for example, if you are an expert in mason wasps, you could look through a particular geographic area in a species and make sure all the observations in that are correct, and then bump them out if they aren't. So it's more about that curation that makes the collection projects more accurate.
Okay. And Melissa asked kind of an associated question. Is it possible, or maybe how, to solicit experts for a local project? So that those, because, the key is, I think with the bees, we're in great shape because we have so many experts who are in there all the time answering a lot of BID issues, but wildflower projects, other projects are a little more challenging to get those IDs done.
I agree. I think, researching and exploring wasps, for example, for my recent book, there are very few experts on iNaturalist. So anything that we can do, the general public, to bring in more experts because there are definitely a lot of, I'm not going to say knowledge gaps, but expert gaps where you may observe something and it'll sit out at family level for years because there are no expertise of someone using iNaturalist. So we can maybe recruit some folks from seasoned pros from Bug Guide over to do more insect-related curation.
I will mention that I have used the app Seek on photographs on my computer. So if I have uploaded an observation of a bee on a flower, and I'm more interested in the bee identification, I still use Seek to help me identify the flower. And so that's one, it's one neat way to use Seek. You don't have to be out in the field observing. You can use it on, still photos.
That sounds great. I have an aster growing in the corner lot restoration that I need to get Seek for. I don't know what it is.
Let's see. Do you have any WASP identification go-tos you'd recommend to genus perhaps? There are increasing bee resources, but it's hard to find the WASP resources.
Yeah, well, my latest WASP book is tailored for Eastern North America, and it focuses on the frequent flower visiting wasps, and it's to either genus or species level. So if you may want to check that out. It really, what I learned researching that book was there really aren't that many guides out there, and they are much needed. For example, common genera that people frequently photograph, such as Cerceris, the beetle wasps. A lot of those, genera really need some taxonomic updates or keys that are better made available to the public. So Western North America, I'm not aware of any guides yet, but hopefully someone would delve into a project like that.
Finally, just to find you on iNaturalist, just to kind of reiterate, because some folks were having trouble knowing how to do that. In that search box on iNaturalist in the top left-hand corner, you can type in a name or a project that Heather mentioned, or a species that you're looking for. It can be common name or scientific name. And then you'll get some suggestions for where to go. So for example, if you type Heather Holm, you can view her observations, or you can, and I just forgot the word that they use, about. So you can click on about and you'll get Heather's profile. And remind me, Heather, is that how folks can follow you?
Yeah, I think once you navigate to someone's profile, you can follow them. Yeah.
And as she said, you'll get an update. I know when Heather's been out in the field or back at her computer uploading those photographs. So it's a really neat way to see what, folks are out there looking at wherever your interests lay. So Heather, thank you so much for your talk today. It was a wonderful webinar. I know I learned a lot. There's so many details about iNaturalist. I hope that folks who are new to iNaturalist don't feel intimidated. I would encourage you to go in there and play, pick a plant or an insect you're interested in and just learn more, look at the maps, look at the locations, and you can learn species information. Phenology on iNaturalist it's a great informational tool, in addition to being a great way to upload your observations and share those across the globe. So just some really great projects that you discussed, Heather. I always learn so much from you. So thanks so much, folks. I know that Heather would appreciate a thank you in the chat box, and can't wait till our next series. I'd love to tie you back in again, Heather.